Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reeder with Future Pastimes, the designers of the classic Dune board game, Cosmic Encounter, and many other games. And in this video, I want to talk about how Future Pastimes took their old game Borderlands, which was published in 1982, and turned it into Arrakis: Dawn of the Fremen, which came out this year, 2022. 40 years since Borderlands came out, which was a game that was way ahead of its time, considering all of the games that have come out since then. But then we updated it and we took it in new directions, really leveraging the Dune setting and making a lot of thematic changes to Borderlands that improved gameplay and made it feel more like a Dune game. What's interesting about Borderlands is that the tagline here is a game of the barbaric future, and it looks like, it takes place in the way past, but it's kind of fairly analogous to how the Fremen culture is on Dune. It's, thousands and thousands of years in the future. It is the far future, but the Fremen lifestyle and the culture and the warfare is fairly primitive. They're not using, laser guns, even though laser guns are a thing in the Dune universe, but not on Arrakis. It's, it's knives mostly, and, mauler pistols, which are spring-loaded guns that shoot darts. So it is really very much like that kind of a setting, and it works really well, which is why we thought, yeah, this can work. In Borderlands, it's an area control game, and I'll show you what the board looked like in Borderlands. Here's the board. It's kind of a playmat, and it was fairly large too. This is a decent size, that's it. But it's area control. So you have these different territories. And at the start of the game, you're going to claim every territory. You take turns putting your warrior tokens down, this is what they look like. They just have a little one to let you know that's their combat strength. So it's area control. But what's really kind of brilliant, in my opinion, about this game is that it's something where there's no hidden information. Combat is not determined by rolling dice or, playing cards and adding things up. All the information is there on the board for you to see. Can you take advantage of your positioning to capture territories and have surprise moves that the other players don't notice? Because really the premise is, if you have more strength in your territories surrounding the territory that you want to take over, as opposed to how much strength that player's territories contribute to it, if you have more strength, you just take it over. So you are using the other resources in the game to marshal your strength to the certain areas so that you can take those territories. But the other players can see that you're doing that. But you have the ability with some of your units to come from a few territories away. And since they can move 3 territories, you're never really sure where they're going to end up. So that's your surprise element. So it's a really interesting approach to combat in a game. And like I said, it lent itself really well to Arrakis and the Dune setting. So a few things that the games have in common. They're both played over a series of what are called cycles that have a few different phases. There's a development phase where you're taking resources that you have previously gathered in specific territories, and you're creating things with them. So in Arrakis, you are creating things like still suits and crisp knives, and ultimately sieges, because this is what you're going to need to win the game. So you need to build them, and this shows you what resources you need to have in a territory to build them. So if you want to make a still suit, you just need a spice token or a water token or a food token. But if you want a crisp knife, which has a higher strength combat value, which is not shown here, but it is on the tokens, you need to have 2 spice in that territory, or if you have a worm tooth and a water, you can build that there. For the sieges, you would need 4 spice tokens, or 1 of each of the 4 resources. So we have food, water, worm tooth, and spice will let you build a siege. And if you control 3 sieges in your territories at the end of a cycle, you win the game. That's what you're driving toward. So in the development phase, you're taking those resources and you're making stuff with them, but you've got to get them to the territory where you want to build them. After development, you have a production phase. And so the production phase is where you have certain territories have production sites. So for instance, if you have a spice production site, you will produce one spice token in that territory, as long as there already aren't any spice tokens there. So if you want to keep producing spice, you've got to get the spice out of that territory after you produce it, so that in the next cycle, you can produce another one, because you're going to need multiple spice to build a siege or to build whatever. So after the production phase, you're going to have a trade phase, and that is where you can trade your resources with the other players. Each player gets a chance to trade with each other player. So you're giving somebody else something they need, but it's because you desperately need something else. You may not control any sites that produce spice, but you want that spice. Or you may control both of the food production sites and nobody else can produce food. So you're able to leverage that to get what you need. Then there's a shipping phase. And in the shipping phase, you're able to make one shipment action to move resources from one territory to another. In many cases, you're just moving them the one territory, but you may have ways to move multiple territories. Then you have an action phase. And in the action phase is where you're able to attack the other players, but there are other actions that you can do. So both games do that. We added another phase at the end called the council phase. And the council phase in Arrakis, it's very similar to the Mentat pause phase in the Dune board game, where you're just kind of assessing, all right, has anybody won? What's going on in the game? In Arrakis, it's where you can make formal alliances, and it's where also you can decide that one player or an alliance is just so far ahead that it seems inevitable that they're going to win, and you can decide as a group, all right, I think this game is over. All right, we did what we could. You guys can't be stopped. So that's it. You don't have to go through like, oh, let's play the 3 more cycles so that we can do what we know is already going to happen. Although there are a number of things in Arrakis that are not in Borderlands that can help a player who has fallen behind. And it is one of the areas that we're most excited about in the design process. And it's this concept of water debt, which is a Dune concept. So everybody has a supply of these water ring tokens in your player color. And when you attack another player and you take over their territory, you have incurred a water debt and you give them a water ring token. Now, one token on it by itself doesn't really mean anything, but as the game progresses, if you have collected several of these water debt tokens, which because multiple players have taken over your territories, during the development phase, you can cash in 3 water debt tokens belonging to other players, returning them to those players, to get 2 of any resources. So it shows here food and water, but you could get 2 spice or a worm tooth and a water, which is all you need to make a crisp knife or whatever you want. And if you have 5 of them, you could cash them all in at once to get 3, any 3 tokens that you want. The other thing that you can use these water debt tokens is to stop somebody from taking over one of your territories. So if I'm playing red, and I've collected 2 of the green players' water debt tokens on a future turn during the action phase, they may say, all right, great, I'm going to attack you in this territory where you have your spice production token. And I'd be like, you know what, I really don't want you taking away my spice production. So I'm going to put those 2 green water debt tokens in that territory. And now for the rest of that cycle, you cannot attack that territory, nor can you help anybody else attack that territory. So it's a nice way to kind of pump the brakes, as it were, on an aggressive player. And it lets those players who are getting beat down a chance to come back or to maybe stave the tide long enough for them to change their fortunes. So that's one of the big changes from Borderlands to Arrakis, is a little bit of a catch-up mechanism. Another big thing is that we added this idea of scavenging. There's a lot of rich Dune culture that we wanted to tap into, but this is a game that's set in Dune terms in the far past. It's thousands of years before the events in the novel Dune, where the Atreides are taking over spice production on the planet. So this is an age where the Fremen are just starting to take over the desert territories of Arrakis. And so each player is representing a different Fremen tribe. And, the Fremen are the greatest warriors in the Imperium, even greater than the Emperor's dreaded Sardaukar. Well, how did they get that way? Well, it's part of it is they're living in a harsh environment of Arrakis, sure, but the Fremen culture is a warrior culture. If you want to lead the tribe, you got to call out the leader and you've got to kill them in combat. And they have the Amtal rule where they challenge each other to the death. So this is a culture where they are fighting all the time for supremacy. And it's before the Fremen were largely united against common enemies. So that's the setting of Arrakis, and all of the combat was important to it. But there were other elements that we wanted to bring into the game. So the scavenge deck is one of the actions that you can take in the action phase. You have 2 actions every cycle. The first one is you can either attack another player or you can scavenge. And after you've done that action, your second choice is to attack or make a shipment action. And so you could potentially attack twice. You could scavenge for something and then attack, or you could attack or scavenge and then ship some resources so that you can develop a siege or weapons or what have you in the next cycle. But some of the stuff that you can scavenge for, you're going to draw a card from the scavenge deck. So this is one of the rare elements of randomness that is in Arrakis. But just about everything in the scavenge deck is useful in some way or another. Certainly some things are going to be way more useful at any given moment. So for instance, if you found a Mala pistol, which I mentioned earlier, this is a token that you can then place in one of your territories. There's a corresponding Mala pistol token with 2 strength. So that can make a territory suddenly a lot more powerful. You may have been like, all right, I don't have the strength to attack this player. So I'm going to scavenge. Now you've got 2 more strength because you can place that token in any of your territories when you get it. And so you're like, you know what? Now I do have the strength, so my second action is going to be to an attack. Or it can be to help to bolster your defenses. You might find a Jubba Cloak, which will has its own 1 strength, but it makes one of your areas with the still suit more mobile. It can move an extra territory. You may just find resources. So like we found a food, and you can place that where you want. You may have had a territory where you had spice, water, and a worm tooth, and now you've got a food. Well, guess what? Now you can build a siege, and that is how you're going to win the game. So one of the areas that we made an improvement on Borderlands, one of the things that happens is that in 3 of the phases, as you'll notice, they've got these little arrows around it on the Arrakis phase tracker for production, trade, and shipping. And that is because these phases might not happen. In Borderlands, when you get to those phases, you would roll a 6-sided die. And if you rolled a 6, that phase doesn't happen this cycle. There's no production. So you're just dealing with whatever you produced in the last cycle that you haven't already developed. Or there's no trade. Or you're not able to ship. And now you have to adjust. And that is the other random element to Borderlands. So it's a game that's fairly low on the randomness. But we felt that 1 and 6 was maybe too frequent for a phase not to happen. And because in this day and age we could make custom dice, we went with a D12. So if you roll the storm icon, that means that phase won't happen. And again, it only affects your production, the trade, and the shipping. You always will be able to do the action phase. You will always be able to develop if you've got those resources, and the council phase always happens as well. So 1 in 12 chance that a phase won't happen. It can still have a pretty big impact on the game, and it is exciting to be like, we didn't produce anything, so now I am incentivized to maybe go after some of your resources that are still on the board, try to capture those territories. The other thing that we thought was interesting is because the spice production on Arrakis is it's a rare and unpredictable and dangerous thing, that maybe 1 in 12 is actually still too much for it to happen. So we introduced this idea of these custom icons. We have the 2 moons, the full moon and the crescent moon, and we took the 4 spice production sites that you're going to have in the game, and we broke them into 2 categories. So we have full moon spice production and crescent moon spice production. And the way it works is if you roll the crescent moon, then only the crescent moon sites will produce spice. And if you've got a full moon site, it doesn't produce at all. So that will make which spice production sites you control an important part of the game. Of course, you can roll both, and that means it'll happen. And certain other things, like if you roll the eye, that means whoever is the lead player will decide, do all of the sites produce or do none of them produce? So it's kind of like you can impose a storm so that nobody's producing anything. Or you can say, you know what, I do want, even though you're going to be able to produce your spice, I want to still be able to produce my spice, so I'm going to do it. Similarly, there's a council icon, and that's where the players will vote. Should everything produce or should nothing produce? And then you've got the worm. And the worm is special because in Borderlands, you had horses that you could produce, and that would help you with shipments and other effects. We decided that sandworms were probably a better way to do that. So you can use the sandworms because they can move 3 territories to ship stuff, longer distances. But they could also be used for combat. So a sandworm is going to bring in extra combat strength. And because it can move 3 territories, it doesn't have to be bordering on a territory that you want to take. It can come from further away and then pow. You have an unpredictable strike that the players, maybe all of them didn't see it coming. But if you've rolled the sandworm in the production phase, that means that everybody loses a sandworm. They get tuckered out, they burrow underground, and they take it easy. So otherwise, you would be producing another sandworm every cycle. However, the sandworms are called by thumpers, so we added a thumper token as well that has a full moon and a crescent moon side. And just like the spice production, the production die here will determine which kinds of worms are actually answering the call and which ones are not. And again, that can have a big effect on how the game unfolds. But what happens is the lead player will decide which side of their token they want to use. They'll be like, I'm going crescent, and then you go clockwise around. Everybody can go crescent so that there's parity. Either we're all going to get a worm or none of us are going to get one. Or you can take a chance, you can gamble and you say, you know what, I think you're going to roll a full moon, which will give me an advantage. Or maybe you're just desperate. You're like, I need some extra combat strength to bolster my southern border here. So I'm counting on getting that worm. The worm tokens are double-sided. So, and they've got a handy-dandy little storage solution here that comes with Arrakis. But I open this up and find a sandworm. Here we go. So you can see the sandworms have got the 2 strength and the 3 is their movement. But anytime you produce a worm, you can choose instead to promote it. Or if you do not produce a worm because you picked crescent moon and it rolled full, instead of getting a new worm, you can promote your existing one to a great maker. So that is a 3 strength worm that can move 5. And when you've got a token that can move 5 territories across the board, you can make some really amazing surprise actions. Because part of how the combat works, like I said, it's all about the strength bordering a territory. So if, for instance, I've got units in these territories here that all border with depression, oddly enough, which is the territory I want to take. I just need to have more strength than this player has in this territory and any of their territories that also bear on it. So if they've got a total of 4 strength here and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 here, I don't have enough. I don't have more, but I might have a worm, not here, but 3 territories away, or if it's a great maker, 5 territories away, that I can just, from that space, I can bring them into this territory to help take it. And any of my other developments like still suits or crisp knives, and you can only have 1 of each in a territory, but if I've got a still suit and a crisp knife, that's 4 more combat strength that I can bring with the worm into that territory. And that's where the combat gets very explosive and really interesting. So the effect of the die can be pretty impactful on the game. Now, all those crazy effects, that only happens in production. When you're rolling the die in trade and in shipping, it's more binary. It's just, will there be trade or will there be shipping? If you roll the worm, you don't lose a worm in the shipping phase. It just means shipping happens. You didn't roll a storm, or you didn't roll, the eye where the lead player would decide, or the council where the people will vote. So it is a lot more, it's more likely that those phases are going to happen. You only really need to pay attention to special effects in that production phase. So a lot of these things are what I think make Arrakis far more thematic in terms of the Dune theme. But they are building on those mechanisms from 40 years ago. That was 40 years when Borderlands came out. So that's kind of it. That's a high level, and then getting too deep into how to play Arrakis, but I did want to show where some of the overlap was between Arrakis and Borderlands, how we leveraged some of those interesting mechanisms that made Borderlands a very unique game in 1982. But we've modernized it, and it's a cutthroat game. You are going after the other players if you want to win, but even the players that get attacked a lot have some recourse to try to get out of it. And then the really interesting thing I think about the council phase, which I think bears mentioning, is that anything that you want to do has to be unanimous. And it's by and large, it's like, all right, we want to form an alliance, but instead of just like, all right, the two strongest players want to form an alliance, the other two players can just stop that. They can say, no, you can't form an alliance because then you'll just destroy us. So you have the ability to change the objectives slightly. You can say, I'll tell you what, you two strong players, you want to form an alliance. If that's the case, then instead of needing 3 or 4 sieges, you guys need 5 sieges to win the game. But our weak alliance only needs 2. And if all 4 players can agree on that, then that's how it is. And if they want to change it in the next council, again, they all have to agree. So if one player is like, I want to get out of this alliance, they can't get out of the alliance unless the other 3 players are into it. Now, of course, you can play Arrakis with 3 or even with 2. It's still a really good 2-player game. You're not going to have alliances in that case. But you can change things up in the council. You can say, one person can just resign. They can say, you know what, I'm going to vanish into the desert because I'm just devastated. I can't possibly come back, I don't think. Or what they can do is they can say, you know what, I think you probably could come back in this 2-player game, and I'll tell you what, you only need 1 siege to win, and I'll need 5. And that might be all the incentive they need to keep going. For them, it's the challenge. Can I still win even though, I've increased the number of sieges I need, or this person is really strong, but I just need 1 siege. And so if I can just hold them off long enough to build it, I've won the game against the greater odds. So that's kind of what I like about Arrakis, is that you can make those minor modifications to suit your needs as long as everybody agrees. So there you have it. I'll be doing some more videos on Arrakis. We have a playthrough video, and I'll add a link to the description so you can see a whole game of that. We play this with some of the guys from the Dune Discord community, and we're going to be playing it on our Future Pastimes Discord as well. We use Tabletop Simulator. We have a real good Arrakis mod that is on there. So yeah, check that out. And if you've got questions, let us know. And thanks for watching.